Bitcoin, the original cryptocurrency. The root problem with conventional currency is all the trust that's required to make it work. The history of fiat currencies is full of breaches of that trust. Satoshi Nakamoto. What is Bitcoin? Keeping in mind that although Bitcoin was not the first idea of a cryptographically based digital currency, it's the first to ever gain traction. I was about to say the word succeed, but thus far it has seen success, but it is certainly the most prominent and the cryptographic currency that we all view by and large as the first adopted cryptographic currency. And its value and its technology is centered around these components that we're about to cover right here. Peer-to-peer, permanent ledger, which is the blockchain, and the digitally native value. So Bitcoin was designed to be an entirely peer-to-peer network. From mining and security to transactions and custody, Bitcoin operates without the need of any trusted third party. A true bare asset in digital form. Triple entry accounting was made popular by Bitcoin's blockchain structure. Permanent and chronological in nature, the Bitcoin blockchain serves as a perfect, objective, and open record of all transactions and users. A fully auditable financial system available for the world. Why trust when you can verify? Modern history lacks context for a programmatically scarce asset with goals of disrupting the monetary system. Though many variants of money and currency have been trialed throughout history, fiat has an impressive track record of eventually crashing to zero. In contrast to baseless fiat, principles of hard and sound money are coded within Bitcoin's DNA. In a world of endless money printing and inflating fiat, Bitcoin seems to be doing all right. Now, the peer-to-peer aspect of Bitcoin, its decentralized nature, the greatest benefit that comes from that innovation is the removal or the elimination of what is known as counterparty risk. And counterparty risk is this idea that effectively anytime you have to deal with a third party, there is a risk inherent in having to even deal with a counterparty, because effectively it requires you to trust that they are going to behave in a way that is in alignment with whatever was agreed upon when you entered into the contract or the working agreement with that counterparty. So concrete example, any money that is put inside of your bank account, you are entering into an agreement with that custodian, with that counterparty. All the paperwork that you sign, you're agreeing to effectively what their operation parameters and protocols are. Being peer-to-peer and decentralized, it eliminates the need to worry about that counterparty risk. And that's from the custody side of it when you hold your private keys because no one else has to be the custodian of it. And that's from the mining side. Now the permanent ledger, what the main benefit of this really does and provides is an ability for all parties to know that all the transactions on that ledger are valid in chronological order and that there's no obfuscating of transactions, of a history. Because if one thinks about typical accounting, right? Let's say you're a baker and then there's an investor. The baker could potentially hide certain transactions from the accounting record that they show their investor as a way to manipulate the perception of what is happening to the financials of that bakery. With triple entry accounting, you can't do that because all parties see in every single transaction in, out, who it is to, who it is from, and then it's also reflected in the other person's ledger automatically. The digitally native aspect of it, initially when Bitcoin came about, there was a bit of pushback from certain people as far as what it actually meant for there to be something that was digitally native and how that could be different from people using their debit cards and transactions and wires and PayPal and things of that nature. But the fact of the matter is, when you use any of those sort of platforms like a Cash App, a PayPal, even using Zelle, something like that, what's actually happening is that on the very back end, and this goes all the way up to the Bank of International Settlements and so on, they're basically pinging and ponging their balance sheet between each other. That's very different than an asset that only exists in digital space and immediately settles the moment that the transaction takes place. Okay? So those are some of those key differences that may not be as apparent on the surface. So how does Bitcoin actually work? Well, Bitcoin is powered and created through a process known as mining. Miners contribute computational resources to the network in effort to confirm pending transactions by adding them to the Bitcoin ledger. Using proof-of-work consensus, every 10 minutes, roughly, miners must work to solve a complex SHA-256 hash equation that confirms the contents of the block to be valid before new Bitcoin is minted and given to the miner as the block reward. So this whole process, there are several different components similarly to what we just covered. So let's start with the distribution aspect. While pools dominate the industry, mining can be done by anyone, assuming that you have the right hardware. In the early days, mining could be done on a consumer-grade computer, but now dedicated machines such as ASICs, which are application-specific integrated circuits, to access to relatively cheap energy are requisite to be a profitable miner. Still, anyone dedicated enough can join in. Proof of work. Though critics have cited Bitcoin as an environmental threat due to massive energy requirements, the large power draw gives the network its tremendous security. Some have equated Bitcoin and proof of work as the ability to convert energy, both technological and physical, into a scarce monetary good that cannot be censored, confiscated, or copied. Block rewards. Issued every 10 minutes roughly, the block reward mints a fixed number of Bitcoin, eventually entering circulation when miners sell their virgin coins to cover their operational cost. The reward is programmatically reduced by 50% every 4 years until 21 million Bitcoin have been minted. This supply schedule, known as the halving, drives price action and encourages miners to add hash power, which boosts the network security in a virtuous cycle. So given that the mining can be done by anyone, it's in concept, in theory, mining can be done by anybody. But the reality is, given the constraints of economies of scale, based on how many people have gotten into the mining game, it is much more difficult for any individual to run out and mine Bitcoin. Nevertheless, what's actually much more obtainable for anybody to do is to run out and run a node where instead of mining new Bitcoin, they're actually able to just run their own node that is a record of all the transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain. So they're not solving any of the SHA-256 equations to then be rewarded new Bitcoin, but rather they are just hosting and running another added version of the ledger so that they actually have direct access to that ledger. Think about if consumers were able to have access to the books of JP Morgan or of Fidelity, right? That's what most people can still do with Bitcoin. They can run the ledger to keep a log of all the transactions that have ever happened, but it is much more difficult to actually run a setup where you are mining new Bitcoin. Now, as far as proof of work itself goes, this is a consensus mechanism that was chosen out of the gate, which has always been what Bitcoin has used. And part of what proponents of it say is its main value is that it forces people to have a physical commitment. And granted, given how much the mining scene has grown, more and more energy is required to run a profitable mining operation. And this goes back to why a lot of people, even if they are running their own mining rig at home and it might be a little bit more subtle or a little bit more humble, they can usually find a way to join a larger pool, whether it's the ant mining pool or some of these bigger groups of people who are individually mining. And then that way they kind of can piggyback off of the rest of the work. Now, granted, the rewards they get are going to be a fraction, basically tantamount to the proportion in which they are contributing to that pool, but it can kind of help them get into the game and not be completely at risk of never solving anything because of how small they are. But the proof of work consensus mechanism, it makes it very, very difficult to attack the network and to control the mining network. Because it being so energy intensive, one would have to spend a lot of money, acquire a lot of resources and a lot of energy to effectively commit a 51% attack or try to coordinate enough people to perform that 51% attack. And similarly, the proof of stake mindset that Ethereum is using and a lot of other projects that are coming about, there's a similar mindset that proof of stake requires so much capital to attack the network, similarly to the energy requirements of proof of work. But the difference is it's easier for somebody to get into mining in a proof of stake system, because then it could almost just be a way for them to invest in the ecosystem, pool their funds, or similarly, they can join a larger pool and contribute a fraction as opposed to needing the full amount required to do a solo stake. And then the block rewards, this is basically the halving cycle. And so far, up to this point in history, the markets in terms of bull and bear market within the cryptocurrency and blockchain space has been dominated by this 4-year halving cycle. Because every 4 years, the amount of new Bitcoin that gets issued as a reward gets cut in half. And so basically over time, the rate at which the money supply, so the velocity of new Bitcoin issuance, it gets cut in half every 4 years until it reaches that 21 million mark. So when Bitcoin first came out the gate, it was just cranking new Bitcoin. 4 years later, that amount, that velocity got cut in half. 4 years after, got cut in half. And that continues to happen, which puts pressure on the supply side, because supply is being cut in half, effectively new supply, which often has an effect of driving the price way up because the scarcity just doubled effectively. And then the way that new Bitcoin come onto the market, the free market, open market, is typically these miners, when they get the new reward, they sell the Bitcoin that they've earned onto the free market as a way to cover their expenses. And then obviously some of these miners are holding on to Bitcoin as an investment for it to grow down the road. But there's a certain amount of turnover where these miners have to sell in order to cover their cost, operationally speaking. So let's talk about the technology of Bitcoin. Well, in terms of pros, it's stable and time tested. It's secure and attack resistant. It's fully decentralized, and it's well studied and well researched. Now, some of the downsides, it has low transactions per second, so low throughput. It has limited capability in terms of what it can actually do. Now, technically, there are ways in which smart contract-esque protocols can be designed, or rather functions designed using Bitcoin, but it's far more limited than anything you'd see with a native smart contract platform like Ethereum, Polkadot, what Cardano is aiming to do, so on and so forth. Other downside is that it's very, very energy intensive to use and rely upon proof of work, because at the end of the day, even when you have the technology, you're going to need immense amounts of energy. But the flip of that is that, assuming miners are going to continue, it can force an adaptation that actually then becomes an incentive mechanism for the wider adoption of green and renewable technologies to mine Bitcoin. The other downside is that it's a bit of a walled garden. So it's, at this point in time, quite difficult for any other blockchain to interoperate with Bitcoin. And granted, part of that is because of the secure nature of Bitcoin. It effectively has one job: store value. But as a result, it can be tricky for there to be more complex or nuanced integrations with other blockchains. Now, the way that you'll see this workaround is something like wrapped Bitcoin, for instance. And wrapped Bitcoin is a way for other chains to host Bitcoin on their chain in a native capacity, but there's a workaround where effectively you have to switch out a native original Bitcoin Pure, in its pure form, for the wrapped version on one of these chains. So on Ethereum, it's wrapped Bitcoin, and then on the REN blockchain, you have RBTC, and there are just different ways in which different smart contract blockchains have worked around to be able to get Bitcoin to be used as collateral or as an asset on top of their chains, but that is not any native functionality built into Bitcoin's code itself. And the team. Pros, it's a very focused team for Bitcoin, because the goal of Bitcoin is very focused, so that energy is focused very specifically. It's also a very diligent and patient team. Up to this point, there have effectively never been any security hacks, attacks, or anything of that sort directly on the Bitcoin chain, the Bitcoin blockchain, because of how robust in its security and how dialed in its purpose is. So this is in a lot of contrast with the Ethereum team, for instance, where there's this mindset of let's just keep building, let's just keep trying things. That's not what the Bitcoin ecosystem does. They're very, very diligent before they amend anything to the Bitcoin blockchain in terms of how it is coded and how it works. As a result, they have a very proven track record. Any upgrades, any Bitcoin improvement proposals that have been made, they've gone through effectively flawlessly, and that's that's due to how diligent the team is. And there is weak to no leadership. And that may sound funny as a pro, but most people who are very Bitcoin purist in their mindset, there's this idea of never putting too much trust or too much faith or too much power in any one entity. So it goes back to the idea of mitigating counterparty risk. And so by lacking any sort of strong leadership, when Satoshi stepped back from the project, whether that was one individual or thousands, it created a situation where nobody in the Bitcoin ecosystem is really looking to any one person for guidance or answers on what should happen next. As a result, it requires much more coordination and effort on the part of separate individuals and developers choosing to work together out of desire and not because they were coordinated and corralled by some leadership. Now, on the flip side, not having any leadership can be a con, because sometimes to really push to the next level, it can require leadership to show everybody else that vision and be able to make that a reality, as opposed to waiting and hoping that all these separate, scattered individuals will come together of their own accord in unison to push something further that may require a larger coordinated effort. Other downside is it's relatively small. When you look at something like Ethereum and how many projects have spawned as a result of being able to use the coding language of Solidity or some of these other methods of employing smart contract protocols, it's created tens of thousands, if not millions, of offshoots in terms of developers, development, and people building products in that space. That's not the case inside of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin effectively has one function, and natively, there's not that much one can do to really change that other than building companies around Bitcoin. But still, most of those companies are designed as savings products or lending and borrowing products, and that's effectively where the state of things exists at present. And as a result, there's a relatively small ecosystem and team around Bitcoin when you compare it to something like Ethereum. Also, complacency. Purist will go back and fall on, oh no, it's not broken, we don't need to change anything, it was designed right out the gate. But when a technology comes about and then becomes complacent because they feel that the technology is already exactly where it needs to be, it creates an opportunity for new technologies to come along and supplant that prior one, because they're innovating, because they are building on top of the strengths of that underlying technology. And that's part of why there is a growing movement of believers and a growing body of evidence that Ethereum could replace Bitcoin as a store of value, because of how much utility and how diverse Ethereum is when you compare it to something like Bitcoin, which is absolutely stagnating in the sense of updating its technology, even though it's very, very good. It's unbeaten in its use case. The other downside is that it's a bit of a maximalist or tribal framework on the side of the Bitcoin team, where it's this idea of everything that's not Bitcoin is a shit coin and Bitcoin is perfect and flawless. Now, granted, you can still be a maximalist and see that Bitcoin is not perfect, but there is a lot more of a tribalist mentality around the Bitcoin community than any other community I've seen. Maybe aside from Ripple's XRP, maybe. And then there is this winner-take-all framework that's often espoused by Bitcoin diehard purists that at the end of the day, the only reason anybody should be investing in the cryptocurrency space should be to get exposure to Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is what's going to be what takes over the world at the end of the day, and everything else is going to erode away into nothingness because of its shit nature. And once again, I don't think that's really helping push the blockchain space further. I don't think it's helping Bitcoin open its eyes to see what else it could do to innovate. And so all in all, winner-take-all frameworks are often a losing game. And then tokenomics. So Bitcoin experienced a fair distribution, meaning that out the gate, there wasn't a certain amount held on to for developers or investors. It got switched on, and then you could start mining it. So granted, you had to be in the know about it, but it's the fairest distribution thus far compared to almost any other project, because most other projects are not Bitcoin. They were built on Ethereum for the most part, or some other blockchain that's basically an Ethereum competitor, and then almost every time they have to sell a certain amount of these tokens and hold a certain amount in their treasury so that the project has funding out the gate. The other pro is that there's a fixed supply and a fixed issuance schedule. So this is, in a nutshell, the block reward and the 4-year halving cycle. And this historically has always driven the bull markets and the bear markets for cryptocurrencies. Then deflationary. Over time, Bitcoin is designed to taper off in its supply, and then it hits a ceiling of how many will ever be created. And so that's very, very good to drive the scarcity narrative and thus push up the value, because if there is increasing demand over time, which is what we have seen happen for Bitcoin, but there is decreasing supply and demand economics dictates that the price will go up. And then the specific use case, it's really, really dialed in on being a store of value. Bitcoin's not trying to do anything else other than preserve value over time. And in that case, it's done exceptionally well, flying colors. Downsides, limited use case. If that's the only real value of Bitcoin is how well it stores value, but there is something down the road that comes along and is a better store of value, even if we just say it's as good a store of value, but it does other things as well, there's a chance that that asset becomes more valuable than Bitcoin. Proof of work mining. A lot of flack for the energy consumption required for proof of work mining. And it does not seem like there are many people in the Bitcoin camp who are too gung-ho to switch Bitcoin from being proof of work to proof of stake. I don't think that'll ever happen, or it'll take a lot for that to happen. As such, that's uphill battle unless and until there can be sufficient movement made so that the proof of work becomes incentive to adopt green technologies. And then the fee-dependent miner compensation post the 21 million Bitcoin being minted. There are definitely discussions and theories as far as what happens and how they can still be paid and compensated with the fees of the network. But that also assumes that there's a high amount of transactions to the extent at which it compensates miners. The other mindset or assumption in this situation, as far as why it would be feasible and still work, is that Bitcoin is worth so much that even if transaction volume is modest compared to other chains, that fee percentage being paid out in Bitcoin is still worth so much because Bitcoin is worth so much, if that makes sense. But this is an issue that no one has had to really face head on because we have not seen the final Bitcoin be minted at this point. So at the end of the day, it's some degree speculation and game theory. Bitcoin's evolving narrative. Over a decade has passed since Satoshi Nakamoto introduced Bitcoin as peer-to-peer digital electronic cash. Though this prospect remains a possibility, time and markets have deemed Bitcoin more akin to a hedge like gold than anything else. The vision to replace fiat was clear and sound at Bitcoin's inception. The Great Recession of '08 was still rippling outward and blockchain lacked significant real-world adoption. The difference between now and then? A $1 trillion plus digital asset market has emerged alongside a robust DeFi ecosystem powered largely by stablecoins built atop smart contract blockchains like Ethereum. Nevertheless, Bitcoin holds most of the market's value.